Welcome back to the Islamophobia files, where we document, dissect, and challenge the systems, narratives, and power structure that sustain global Islamophobia. I'm your host, Dr. Hatem Bazian. Today's episode focuses on a deeply consequential sphere, European politics, and especially how policy frameworks, public discourse, and institutional practices manufacture Muslims as political and social others across Europe, whether in France, the Netherlands, Denmark, the UK, Central and Eastern European states. Islamophobia have moved from French rhetoric and has become embedded in legislative agendas, policing practices, media narratives, and national identity projects. So today, to help us understand this landscape, we are honored to have Dr. Martijn de Koning, one of the leading anthropologists examining Islamophobia, securitization, and political exclusion in Europe. His work critically maps how state agencies and public institutions contribute to the normalization of anti-Muslim sentiment and the construction of Muslims as perpetual outsiders. Today, we'll explore the political and discursive mechanisms that shapes this process, from counter-radicalization regimes to integration policies, citizenship debates, and the rise of far-right and centrist nationalist rhetoric across the European continent. This is a timely and necessary conversation. Europe is not only shaping its own present and future through these policies, is shaping the global architecture of Islamophobia. Dr. Koning, welcome. Martin, it's good to have you with us. So maybe we could begin with a large framing question. How would you characterize the current landscape of Islamophobia in Europe, and what distinguishes today's political moment from earlier decades in relations to Europe?
Thank you. That's an excellent and already indeed very broad point. Basically, the first thing that comes up with me is that it's completely normalized. Given the fact that Muslims are questioned through policies of integration, policies of security, using Muslims as a sort of rhetorical tool in election campaign, it actually hardly raises any eyebrows. The fact that it's so strongly connected to security also sort of tends to depoliticize it, because, well, you know, who is against security? And that actually makes sort of the fight against Islamophobia more difficult, because if Islamophobia is normalized and you fight against Islamophobia, then basically you are the one who is not normal. And I think we can see that in I can see it in media, political rhetoric, different policy areas, and even also among Muslim organizations, who sort of tend to sometimes have the attitude of, yeah, but you know, this is just the way things go.
Now, if we talk about policy arenas, security, immigration, integration, education, which one of these do you think are central to producing the Muslim other? Right? We speak about immigration, we speak about education, integration. So which do you think is driving this, or at the central of it, and which on the periphery? Not to say that one is at least secondary, but there's a central theme that is driving this. In your mind, what do you think is the driving this component? Immigration, education, integration, security? What is it?
I think the most central one would be integration and migration policies. Basically because they sort of set up Muslims as being out of place, out of time, and also actually out of bounds. So out of place in the sense that they're not from here, they don't belong here, or they're just recent arrivals, completely erasing the long history of Muslims in Europe. Also out of time to a certain extent, which is something you can actually see really well in the Dutch context. So a sort of normal idea within, let's say, integration circles is, well, you know, Muslims, they came in the 1960s, so secularization was going on full swing. So basically, they were late to the party, and we were sort of depolarizing society, with religion having much less public influence than in the past. So that's the narrative anyway. So Muslims are basically just too late, and their sort of excessive religiosity is at odds with the secular identity. And then you also come basically at the third point, so out of bounds. Muslims are in nature different from us, because they come from elsewhere, they come from a sort of different time, and they're not only different from us, but they are in that sense also a threat to us. And so they have been set up as an integration problem. And I think other policy areas, for example, counter-radicalization, countering extremism policies, are to a certain extent integration programs in overdrive, focusing almost solely on security. Security is, at least for the Dutch context, I think also for the German and some other European countries, definitely part of the whole integration scheme. That's actually when the whole integration thinking came up, already in the end of 1970s, early 1980s. But the counter-radicalization approach really focuses on Muslims as a security problem, and not so much in saying all Muslims are by definition a security problem, but they have the potential to become a security problem. Like also in integration policies, they have the potential to become a problem for social cohesion and stuff. That is why we need to have special policies for them. We need to monitor them. We need to sort of surveil them, and so on. Related, I think you could also say there's a sort of third area, and that has to do with policies and debates on the freedom of religion, sort of the secular identity, or the relation between church and state. So you could say, on the one hand, for example, okay, the Dutch system and also other European systems definitely give protection to Muslims, giving them equal rights. That's definitely the idea, and to a certain extent it works that way. But if you look in most European countries, even though they would have the right, for example, to establish their own mosques, like Christians can establish churches, in many cases, the right is basically granted, but only after long struggles. It's never self-evident. And there are more and more cases in which the right is not granted or even limited for Muslims. So also in that area, because also in that area, you can see it. For example, about a year ago, we had the Maccabi Tel Aviv riots in Amsterdam. And what happened afterwards was, okay, and Muslims were blamed for, anti-Semitism, chasing Jews, and so on. The story is much more mixed and nuanced than that, but that was sort of the main narrative. And one of the plans the then government came up with was an extra integration extra agenda that included, for example, limiting the public call to prayer. Now, I don't immediately see how limiting the public call to prayer would prevent violence, but that was sort of a normalized idea to have that in the program. So also this more secular or secularist outlook on Islam is also very much tied to violence and security, and also to integration, because, for example, what was said that the public call to prayer doesn't really isn't really part of Dutch culture, so people get scared and so on and so on. Even though legally Muslim organizations do have the right to actually do a public call to prayer.
Now, we're witnessing the rise of right-wing parties across Europe. And definitely a major part of their agenda is Islamophobia, anti-immigrant sentiments, and so on. So how much can we say or isolate that this is a right-wing phenomena versus that it's led to almost every sector of the political landscape, the right, the center left, the far left, if we can say in terms of Islamophobia. So how is the rise of the right wing actually almost impacted or influenced the full spectrum politically?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question, and I think in the European context at this moment, and very debated, very often debated question. I think at the moment, what we see at the moment, if you look at the results of the Dutch elections, but also elsewhere, we indeed see a growth of the far right, but also a sort of stabilization. And they are big. They have grown big over the last decade, 2 decades, and that is more or less stabilizing. So, for example, with the recent elections, the Dutch far-right Freedom Party of Geert Wilders lost some seats, so they're not the biggest anymore, but other parties have gained extra seats, and basically the far-right bloc is more or less, in total anyway, more or less stable. And this far-right bloc definitely provides a sort of push for the mainstream, let's say, the center parties, left-wing, right-wing, center parties, in the sense that those parties adjust their agenda, less so, not so much the rhetoric, but the agenda to the far-right parties. But I think if you have a sort of longer look at it, you actually see something interesting happening already in the 1980s and the 1990s. Because in several European countries, the Netherlands, Belgium in particular, I think, Germany was a little bit later, migration, integration, and by extension also Muslims, were already at the center of debate. And that was not a far-right thing. That was really a center-right thing. So in the Netherlands, for example, the conservative liberals who did that. And I think one of the things we can actually see is that the far-right parties actually learn from that. They can sort of rehash, transform the old rhetoric on country, people, race even, by talking about migrants and the tsunami of asylum seekers, or Muslims flooding the country, and they get away with it. So I think and they're not talking about race or the people anymore, but they're talking about culture, and cultures that are irreconcilable. I think that's a lesson the far right actually learned from the mainstream parties. And they have sort of radicalized it, and definitely also in their rhetoric. So what we see now, basically, again, is that the center parties are adjusting their agendas to the far right parties. And actually, and we know from the work of political scientists, this is not a good strategy. I mean, it's in principle not a very good strategy, but it's also practically not a very good strategy, because it basically legitimizes the far right party. And people think, okay, if the center is legitimizing the far right by taking over their agenda, I might as well vote for the real thing, and that's the far right. And that's exactly what seems to be happening. To a certain extent, this whole questioning of Muslims, you can see it all along the political spectrum. I think in the Netherlands there may be two, maybe 3 parties who don't do that, but for the rest, directly or indirectly, they all do that. Definitely now with the whole migration debates that's sort of interlinked with the Muslim question as well. That probably is not only the fault of the far right, because of course you can point to a much longer history in several European countries in different ways, but a much longer history of Islamophobia and the racialization of Muslims. And you can see some of the patterns, like, for example, the distinction between acceptable Muslims or unacceptable Muslims. That is already one we had in colonial times. That is how we sort of regulated the Muslims in Indonesia when it was a Dutch colony. So some of those distinctions, and also the focus on threat and sort of Muslim takeover, are much older than sort of the last 40, 50 years.
Yeah. Well, you touch on a very important concept in here, which is the thinking of making the argument that the Muslim are the cultural other, and therefore that is not racism; it's just expressing discomfort with a cultural other. And in here, possibly could maybe take a look at the shift from biological difference to cultural difference as the basis of racism, where individuals who, on the one hand, express that they're anti-racist, while in the same sentence go on to embrace cultural difference as the basis for the contemporary form of racism that we see. So how do you see this? Again, you spoke about it, and you actually made the main argument that the center and the left basically taken on the same argument, and the right is winning the landscape.
Yeah, I think this whole sort of, let's say, culturalization of racism that's an important one. Also, strong part of, and also basically in the way you explain it, in terms of normalization of Islamophobia. It's an important thing. What happens there is basically Muslims are sort of homogenized under one label, with people having more or less the same culture. Their behavior or the things they don't do is explained based on sort of stereotypical ideas of that culture. There's a sort of hierarchy attached to it. They are threats, they are oppressed, they come to ruin the country, whatever. And as a fourth step, there's a sort of prescription. Okay, if this is the culture of Muslims, it's bad for social cohesion, so we have to deal with them in a particular way. And that has become sort of mainstream culturalist thinking. Yet I also think we should not make the step from biological racism to cultural racism too big. Already, let's say, in the more classical biological racisms, we already see that culture and a sort of homogenized essentialist notion of culture plays an important role. The main difference, I think, for the European continental context is that we don't talk in terms of race. So we actually have replaced race with other words. Culture is one of them. Ethnicity is another one. And that sort of conceals the whole racialization that has been going on. And of course, you can also point to the longer history. The concept is a bit problematic at this point of time, but if you look at the longer history of anti-Semitism, for example, you can also see sort of the conflation between sort of biological and culturalist notions of race and racism.
Maybe we could shift right now into the structure of counter-radicalization, counter-terrorism, the intervention to try to, in essence, create an acceptable Muslim in that process, whether it's the early program that was put in the Netherlands that to intervene and look at counter-radicalization. It was exported to the UK with a prevent, shaped the CVE, counter-violence extremism in the United States.
Yeah.
It's all modalities are structured around this counter-radicalization and counter-terrorism. So can you really explain what is at work in here from a policy or a European perspectives that shapes the understanding and relations to the Muslims?
Yeah, and I think there are two sort of main mechanisms, ways of thinking that are behind it that play an important role. So first is the notion of we want to prevent terrorist violence, and of course, to a certain extent, it makes complete sense. It's better to prevent act of violence. It's better for potential victims, and it's also better for the perpetrator, basically. So to a certain extent, that makes sense. But what does it mean? It means in practice that what we are doing, we see that in the Netherlands with the counter-radicalization policies, in the UK with Prevent, in the US also with CV and prevention of violent extremism, is that you're basically going to target a whole population or a subset of the population. I had one person in the Netherlands working in these counter-radicalization circles, saying to me a couple of years ago, basically we want to intervene before there are signals of radicalization. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, who are you going to, in what community are you going to intervene into? And interestingly, so now there's definitely more attention in Prevent and also in the Dutch counter-radicalization policies on the far right and far-right extremism. But we don't do that with the same preventive outlook. Mm-hmm. We don't go to spy in churches or football clubs or wherever. That is really something that we do with the Muslim population. And I think another important element is the idea of risk. So again, it's not in those policies, it's not being said that Muslims are by definition terrorists, violent, or whatever. And I think, most people actually working in the industry would really object to that kind of reasoning. But what they do is a risk assessment. You go and look at the Muslim community because there is the potential for violent behavior in a sort of undefined future. And then some risks are acceptable, some risks are unacceptable. The risk of a terrorist attack is definitely unacceptable. The risk that people's constitutional laws, constitutional rights are being damaged, that's an acceptable risk. But for example, what you see in, so I have was actually reading it yesterday, a de-radicalization report on someone who was released from the terrorism department in prison, and de-radicalization assessment actually. And there are a lot of questions in there on Islam, and in particular on Salafism. So what the assessor wants to know, is this person a Salafi Muslim? What kind of Salafi Muslim is he? And does that represent a dangerous form of Salafism? And in that sense, Salafism is not seen directly as something that is violent or leads to violence, but definitely sort of precursor to violence. You can sort of predict violence with that. Interestingly, there was also in that report something on Islamophobia. So was the person in question concerned about Islamophobia? If he was, that could, not in and of itself, but in combination with other factors, that could be seen as a risk to that person committing violence. And I think this risk thinking, because you can never exclude risks in, I mean, for 100%, there is always a risk. And it basically also means that you're going to force a person to prove that they are innocent. But once you do, actually new questions come up. But he looks like the good Muslim, but is he in fact the good Muslim?
The interesting part is that you mentioned that a person interest or concern about Islamophobia is entered as a possible law indicator or indicator. I was lecturing yesterday about the CVE program in the United States, which is structured around counterinsurgency frameworks. And in here, one of the indicators is engaged in activism and participation in civic life is considered as an indicator of a path toward radicalization.
Oh, yeah.
And one of those aspects that constantly appear is the engagement in the question of Palestine or engaging in the Palestine active. So in here, Islamophobia, meaning concern about the well-being of Muslims in public life, is seen as an indicator, and trying to influence your government on an issue like Palestine is also seen as an indicator.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're seeing similar type of modalities in the Netherlands.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I mean, look at France, for example. So they're making the connection between Islamophobia on the one hand and the Muslim Brotherhood on the other hand, with huge consequences for anti-Islamophobia organizations and also the individuals working there. I mean, basically, they can't work anymore in France. And we have also seen that the French government has actually asked the Dutch government for information on Dutch networks, so-called Muslim Brotherhood networks, who are dealing with Islamophobia. So yeah, that's definitely, I would say for now, a sort of low-key criminalization of anti-Islamophobia work going on. But if you look at France, that's not low-key anymore. I mean, that's definitely out in the open. And yeah, also activism for solidarity with Palestine and against the genocide going on in Gaza. Yeah, that is definitely seen as a strong potential risk, actually. People being designated anti-Semitic, violent, intolerant, Hamas supporters, and so on. That, for the Dutch case, has basically always been part of these counter-radicalization assessments. But I think it's somewhat more visible at the moment. I mean, given the context. But there's also a political push towards it. So one of the motions tabled in Parliament, and I also know there were other motions in other similar motions in other European countries. So after the Hamas attacks on 7 October 2023, there was a motion tabled in Parliament that there should be a research into how people in the Netherlands think about pro-Palestine solidarity, Hamas, and so on, as if you can sort of, throw these in one basket. And it wasn't said in the motion itself, but if you looked at the parliamentary debate surrounding that motion, it was about Muslims. Even though Muslims are only a small portion of the pro-Palestine demonstrations, there have been some big demonstrations as well by Muslims, but the majority are other people. And yeah, that is definitely a huge a huge part, and I think it will become a stronger part of the whole counter-radicalization CVE assessments.
Yeah. Building on this, I'm at least concerned, or at least want to observe the bureaucratization of Islamophobia and the bureaucratization and the structure of the bureaucracy that deals with counter-radicalization, terrorism, identification. So how is the structure in terms of bureaucracy? And can we speak that there is a pan-European Islamophobic architecture that is there, sharing of information, strategies, approaches? How do you see this literally making structural Islamophobia within a bureaucratic state infrastructure?
Yeah. Yeah, that's hugely important. And I think there, in particular, the counter-radicalization policies play a huge role, more so than the integration policies, but also other policies, actually. So several European countries have several laws limiting or banning a headscarf or the niqab or something like that, often phrased neutral. So if you look at the Dutch law against the niqab, for example, you wouldn't immediately read that it's about the niqab. Well, until you're actually going to look at the exceptions to the law, then basically there are not many categories left. So that's the thing there, and but definitely with the counter-radicalization policy, what is hugely important are the so-called watch lists. So we have the Interpol watch list, we have the national watch list, there are several national watch lists. And basically what happens, the police is putting a person on a watch list for different kinds of reasons. That list, or that the person's name is then transferred to the Interpol list, or basically automatically, because they are linked. At one point, actually, the Dutch police could get the person's name off the list, of the Dutch list, but not of the Interpol list, and not of the national list of the member states of Interpol. And you wouldn't know that happened. You wouldn't know that you're on it, and you wouldn't know that you're off it until you're traveling. And we have had several cases now of people traveling with an EU passport within the EU, who are placed in detention. For example, at Spanish airport, Turkish airport, because they're on such watch list. Officially, there is a procedure for this, but basically it doesn't really work. I was in one court case, for example, where the police answered to the question by one of the people who was in detention, had been in detention at the airport. And he asked the police, why was I on the list in the first place? And the police then said, well, you were on the list because we wanted to look if you needed to be on the list. Yeah, I mean, if there were probably more reasons, but if that's the criteria, I mean, basically anyone can get on the list. Of course, we do know not anyone is getting on that list. There's also a procedure, for example, banks monitoring financial transactions. Banks themselves actually have been very open in the Netherlands, also in some other European countries, UK, for example, that this indeed has negative consequences for racialized groups, Muslims, but also, for example, Christian migrants who come from Eritrea or wherever. And also in the Netherlands, we basically still have the so-called tax scandal. So many people were listed as fraudsters by the National Tax Service. And criteria to list someone as a fraudster was, for example, gifts to the mosque. Well, a lot of Muslims do that throughout the year, and of course throughout particular months and days in the year. Again, it wasn't the only criteria, but it was one that was made explicit. And it actually had an interesting note saying only non-Dutch religious organizations.
Interesting.
I mean, okay, can we make it any more clearer? So in that sense, you can see indeed that it's fully ingrained within the bureaucratic structures, and also again a sign that it is fully normalized. It's partly based on laws. So, for example, banning the niqab and the law on preventing terrorism, finance, and money laundering. But it also partly really goes beyond the law. But it's definitely, part, and also in terms of exchange of information. So, for example, schools, youth care, police, the mayor, the National Coordinator for Counterterrorism, banks, and I'm probably forgetting some institutions, can now officially share information on terrorism and radicalization. They actually have been doing that for decades now, but now it's official that they actually can do that. And there are, of course, rules and procedures in practice, but it's exactly that makes it part of the whole bureaucratic structure and very difficult to fight against, and also very difficult to actually even address it. Because, it's normal. No, we don't scapegoat every Muslim. We just do a risk assessment. That's the whole thing. So, yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. And, it even worked to such an extent that some lawyers have said, with this monitoring by the banks or these international watch lists, I would rather have my clients have a criminal investigation, official criminal investigation against him than this. Because with an official criminal investigation, I can see the charges, I can see how the investigation is done. My client has certain rights and also even certain privileges. But with these bureaucratic, administrative things, you basically do not have any rights. So it also makes fighting back to these practices really, really hard.
It's literally the bureaucratic structure of creating a large cluster of people without rights to have rights.
Yeah.
Because you're literally in a watch list that restrict travel, restrict your ability to have access. Banks close your accounts, schools refer you to monitoring, all of this without you actually committing any crime.
Yeah.
So literally removes you from civil society and the ability to be normal without actually idealizing normal in this sense. So that's against, and I wanted to maybe stretch this. You have written on geographical exclusion, on neighborhoods, on schools, public spaces as it relates to the Muslim other and Islamophobia. Can you speak to that type of work in terms of how does it function on the everyday life of people in the neighborhoods, in schools, and in public settings?
Yeah. I mean, you see it in many different ways in people's lives. So first of all, Muslims, but that's not only Muslims, I would say migrants in general, are sort of concentrated in specific neighborhoods. Not to the extent, I think, that you can compare it to the French banlieues or something like that. I don't think that is actually the case. But there are definitely concentration areas who then by definition become problem areas. And you could see it. I don't think it's an instrument to still use, but in the past, municipalities, but also real estaters use the so-called livable barometer, which basically gives a score to neighborhoods as to how nice it is to live there. And if there are many people with a migration background, ethnic communities, that's bad for the score. And again, they don't have to do anything bad. They don't have to do anything criminal or whatever. The fact that they are there is enough. So they're put there. They make their living there, and what then happens is, for example, politicians complaining about that this is not a Dutch neighborhood anymore, or that we only have ethnic shops and whatever. Also, by the way, completely disregarding the fact that most of these so-called ethnic shops really tailor to the whole Dutch population, because it's, I mean, simply that's where the money is if you target the whole population. To a certain extent, we also see it, for example, in schools. We had a discussion years ago in the Netherlands on white schools and black schools. So what happened on so-called white schools with a predominant white population, as soon as the percentage of ethnic minorities came, from the top of my head, I'm not entirely sure, about above 30 or 40%, white parents would remove their children from that particular school because they were saying it is a black school. Of course, their action sort of basically created the result. It was a school of ethnic minorities. And indeed, some of these schools, poorly funded, had problems in teaching, in school results of the children, and so on. So there were definitely problems going on. Also, the housing quality there is often worse. There are a lot of sort of what is called social rent constructions there, but also all kinds of private, basically exploitation rents. That's my term. That's not an official term. Yeah, so basically they create problem areas with people that are problematized and so on. But I do have to say, I think on that note, there has also been a lot of improvement. There have been a lot of investments in these neighborhoods. Also, not to forget, the people in these neighborhoods themselves have really done the work to make the neighborhood more livable, to also have a sort of cross-cultural, cross-religious dialogue, to sort of open themselves up to other communities. Municipalities also have invested quite a lot. So I do think there's a lot of improvement there in the last 2 or 3 decades. But yeah, I mean, for example, one of the researches I did longer ago was with the Dutch, Belgian, and German foreign fighters who went to Syria. And initially they came in the Netherlands, but also in the other countries, from 2 or 3 cities predominantly, and particular neighborhoods in those cities. And well, these neighborhoods were already sort of under heavy surveillance, and that completely increased with that. And I think in the Netherlands, it also had to do with this. There was indeed in 2 of those neighborhoods a really strong support base for the foreign fighters. I mean, also like really presenting themselves as the support base, with demonstrations in the particular neighborhood. And after their demonstration came the far right demonstration and so on. I mean, the local people were completely fed up with everyone at one point. But yeah, I mean, these neighborhoods also become a sort of focal point, almost iconic, for the whole discussion on multiculturalism, on Islam, and stuff like that. And perhaps the most a fantastic example, and I really use the word fantastic here in sort of double sense, is what has been called the Sharia triangle. So there was a particular section in the migrant area in The Hague, which was called the Sharia triangle. And that part of the neighborhood I visited quite often. I know a lot of people there, but I couldn't pinpoint it where it was. So I was curious, and I asked people. I got about 5 or 6 different definitions of where that neighborhood actually was, and it was mentioned, the Sharia triangle, in a series of, I think, 3 articles in one of the Dutch national daily newspapers. And it was seen, okay, this so-called Sharia triangle is a neighborhood where the Dutch state and the municipality don't have any say, Sharia rules, and so on. Basically, it was all a fantasy. The journalist invented all articles, even the conversations in there, he invented it. I was at a discussion a couple of weeks later in that particular neighborhood, or close to it. I still don't know where it is. And then one of the aldermen of the city said, yeah, we know that the story has been invented, but it could be true, right? And then I thought, yeah, but if that's the case, we can stop the debate, right? Then just do whatever you think you have to do. But there you could see sort of basically fears about Islamization, fears about the Dutch losing rule of law, whatever that may be, Dutch politicians handing over the city to migrants and Muslims. That all sort of came together, and really not doing justice for the improvements. In the 1990s, it was, some of those neighborhoods were indeed really bad. There's a lot of improvement.
Confusing poverty, lack of job, employment, lack of social investment, with immediately putting the tag on it relative to governing, monitoring, anti-terrorism, radicalization, rather than dealing with addressing poverty, homelessness, people unhoused, and so on. And you could see in here, and maybe I don't know if this would be Eric, instead of trying to address the structural problems economically, politically, it's much easier to create Sharia triangle, the replacement theory, the no-fly zones, all of this, as a way to really avoid the question of how did we get here.
Yeah, exactly. I think the most clear example is what you see in many European countries at the moment, with the discussion on asylum seekers. Sure. If I take the Dutch context again, so there's a lot of discussion on that. What we did basically 10 to 15 years ago is we scaled down the asylum seekers refuge and procedures and stuff like that. At that time, it was already said by colleagues, don't do this. You need to have a sort of reserve that if there's a spike, that you can still, give people decent shelter. No, wasn't done. These were all closed. Now we had a little spike and we immediately had problems. And this then became entangled with another problem, is that people cannot get any housing. So the basic solution, all political, no, not all, but sort of the center and the right-wing political parties have come up with, reduce the number of asylum seekers. It's not going to work. Even if you don't find that problematic at all, it's not going to work, because it's only 8% of the housing goes to asylum seekers, in the actually people with an asylum status. And the rest, that's for other people. So it wouldn't work, but it's basically, again, also indirectly saying, okay, we don't want Muslims, we don't want Black people, we don't want people from the Middle East and not from Africa. That's basically it, because the other migrants, of course, can still come to a certain extent. Yeah, indeed, instead of addressing the structural problems underneath, so failing policies, basically a failing housing market, it's much easier to address the Muslim or the asylum seeker or whoever.
Now, in the last few minutes, maybe, is there any places where you're seeing efforts to counter this rising tide of institutionalized Islamophobia? Are there solidarity movements? Are there alternative political imaginaries, discourses, viewpoints that are making inroads, whether in the Netherlands or other parts of Europe?
Yeah, excellent point. Well, I think where you can see a lot of energy, a lot of new initiatives is sort of on the civil society level. So I don't think there's any European country where we actually have to look at the state for this. That's not going to happen. But definitely on a civil society level. And also, in my case, I don't think I could do my work on Islamophobia if it wasn't for Muslim organizations fighting Islamophobia. So in the Netherlands, for example, Muslim Rights Watch, Stichting Not Islamofobie, but also the CCIE in Belgium, CAGE in the UK. Not only that, sort of they provide material, information and stuff, but also the way they look at things, the actions they do, that's really inspiring, and I learn a lot from that. So there's a lot happening there, and we also see interesting coalitions. For example, Muslim rights organizations partnering up with strategic litigation organizations. And that definitely in the Dutch case, but also I think in the Spanish, French less so, I think, case, that, but in many cases that actually works. And also to a certain extent, I also think that the whole opposition to the genocide in Palestine there creates all kinds of new coalitions. So you indeed see Muslim organizations, but also individuals active. As I said, the majority in most European countries are not Muslims, but there's definitely partnering up, people learning from each other, whether it's the encampments at universities or the occupations of train stations or the large red line demonstrations. So there's a lot happening there, and I do see a lot of potential there. What I see less, and I'm actually I'm looking into it in the last couple of months. So what does this whole pro-Palestine, anti-genocide movement do with Muslim communities? What do Muslim communities do with these movements? What I don't yet see very strongly is a sort of political alternative or thinking about it otherwise. I think, that's definitely happening in the Middle East. I think also definitely developments there in, for example, the US. I see it less in Europe. That probably has also a little to do with the fact that many Muslim spokespersons are a bit reluctant to speak about it in public. So we had a few demonstrations in Europe led by Muslim organizations, led by imams, heavily contested for various reasons. Sometimes also extra complicated because, for example, if I look at Eastern Europe, which of course within Europe has a sort of intra-marginal position, the genocide against the Palestinians and the Israeli actions are very much entangled with the whole debate on Russia and the Ukraine. And which then is also translated immediately in being loyal to the nation states where they are actually in. And of course, the question who is actually threatening us. And that often makes it difficult to speak out in public. I do find it interesting that I've seen now with a few imams, and one in particular actually, but he sort of organized the whole rally, that they actually use sort of language from Islamic traditions, so references to the Prophet Muhammad and the fight for justice and so on, but in such a way that it is actually appealing for a much broader public that includes non-Muslims. And basically saying, well, actually, as one imam literally said, it's just not my business, it's our business. And we're all in this. So perhaps there's a sort of beginning, but I don't see, and that probably also has to do with, basically, that's one of the things I'm sort of thinking out loud now. I think it has, and it's completely understandable that it happens, but I think it has something to do with the focus on 7 October 2023. I mean, and of course, I get it. The actions of the IDF since then are completely horrible. There's an immediate need for aid, for stopping the violence and so on. But it sort of blocks the view, blocks the conversation on what happened before. The genocide and the ethnic cleansing didn't start on 7 October 2023, like Islamophobia didn't start on 9/11 or something. There's a longer history going on. And to a certain extent, I think you can see, for example, several anti-Islamophobia, Muslim anti-Islamophobia organizations are now working on research that sort of looks at the intersection of Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism. And I think they're doing a really important, really good job there. But they also seem to sort of be blocked at this 7 October 2023 thing. Again, I find it completely understandable, given, the atrocities going on at this very moment. But I think to have a sort of alternative political vision, thinking about things otherwise, we need to have sort of this longer critical vision.
So for our last minute in terms of conversation, where do you see some of the needed research on Islamophobia, whether in Europe or other contexts? You mentioned in terms of what you're thinking about the current environment, about the pro-Palestine discourse. What are other areas, if you have any, in relations to Islamophobia, research that is needed to be done?
Well, I think that actually connects to your former question and also my answer to that one. So together with one of my colleagues, Samira Azabar, who's also at Radboud University Nijmegen, we have, with a small group from people from civil society, looking at, okay, can we come up with an alternative agenda on Islamophobia? We know the discrimination on the job market, housing market, schools and stuff. Can we look at other things? I definitely think we need to, as researchers, as academics, we need to sort of co-develop, co-create tools to fight against anti-racism. And I think there a lot of more research needs to be done and can be done together with people from Muslim, but also other civil society organizations.
Dr. de Koning, Martin, thank you for being with us. Thank you for the deep and necessary conversation. Your work reminds us that Islamophobia in Europe is not simply a matter of public opinion or individual prejudice. It is shaped through laws, policies, institutions, and political narratives that define who belongs and who is cast out. As we discussed today, the construction of Muslims as others is not accidental. It's a result of deliberate political project, geographical practices, and securitization logics that have reshaped European identity itself. Yet the struggle you highlight, grassroots organizing, scholarly interventions, research, and cross-community solidarity show that resistance is active, growing, and profoundly necessary at this time. To our listeners, understanding these structures is the first step to dismantling them. Islamophobia is a global, interconnected, and political, and so much more, and need for our responses. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, this is the Islamophobia Files. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay committed to justice. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Atam.